Welcome to Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Join Dr. David Ramadan and Schar School experts as they engage in thought-provoking conversations with elected officials, policymakers, and thought leaders. Listen for in-depth discussions on policies, politics, governance, and career pathways, all designed to elevate your perspectives and expand your mind.
Welcome to another episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. I'm your host, David Ramadan. Today's conversation tackles one of the most consequential challenges facing the United States, the rise of China and what it means for global security, deterrence, and the stability of the Indo-Pacific. Our guest is Dr. Tim Heath, Senior International Defense Researcher at the RAND Corporation, and a recognized expert on Chinese strategy, civil-military relations, and regional security dynamics. He earned his PhD in political science right here at George Mason University. And joining me as a co-host is Dr. John Gordon, as an adjunct senior defense researcher at RAND and an instructional associate professor at Mason. John has decades of experience studying U.S. military posture, joint operations, and force planning, bringing both practitioner and academic insight to our discussion. John also received his PhD from George Mason University. We'll unpack what China's really doing, what it probably won't be doing, and how the U.S. and young professionals and students at Mason should interpret what comes next. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks,
All
David.
right, let's jump in. What does China's buildup really means for all of us? Tim, let me ask you this. What's the biggest misconception in U.S. public debate about China's military ambitions today?
Well, I think one of the largest misconceptions that I encounter is the belief that the Chinese are postured and prepared to carry out aggression against either Taiwan or any of its neighbors. The Chinese military is large, it is modern, it is impressive in many ways, but it is, right now, there's no political indications that the leadership or the military is preparing to launch or initiate any sort of aggression against Taiwan. That's not to say that they're building capabilities that can be used against Taiwan. That's definitely true. But I think it's inaccurate to say that they're postured and prepared to start a war over Taiwan. The military has a defensive posture, I would argue, regarding Taiwan.
So you're distinguishing between capabilities and real readiness.
Correct.
How combat ready is the PLA, really?
I think that can be overstated as well. I don't think they're especially combat ready. What they do have and what worries the Pentagon is a large suite of surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship missiles, and these are deadly. They're very effective. But these are technologies that would be deadly in the hands of any military. I mean, we see in the Middle East, Yemeni rebels, literally goat herders equipped with anti-ship missiles are extremely effective at damaging ships and threatening surface ships that pass through the area. What makes the Chinese military formidable in this regard is that they are rich enough to buy and maintain a huge number of weapon systems, missiles in particular, that threaten aircraft and ships that operate in the Taiwan Strait. That's the most powerful thing about the Chinese military. Everything else about the Chinese military, I think, is much more debatable. The level of training, how free they are from corruption, their command and control system, which is encumbered with all sorts of political controls, which we know from studies of other developing world militaries tends to impair combat effectiveness on the battlefield. And just their ability to maneuver and operate in combat. We haven't seen it. They're completely inexperienced in combat. All of these raise serious questions about how well the Chinese military can operate and fight outside of a Taiwan Strait contingency.
Interesting. And I will turn now my microphone to my co-host, John.
Yeah, David and Tim, this is I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting discussion. It has been already. Tim, you've already alluded to some of the things that I want to raise next with you. Is that given this undeniable buildup of the Chinese military in the last 20 years, especially last 15 years or so, and you've already mentioned some of their most threatening capabilities, like long-range missiles. But however, you pointed out the possible limitations the Chinese have from the perspective of the U.S. military. Observing both the potential strengths of the Chinese military and some of these weaknesses that you've mentioned, what do you think is the best approach from the U.S. military to hedge against the possibility or prepare for the possibility of a conflict with China? Certainly, the American intent is going to be to try to deter any Chinese action. But given what you perceive their strengths and weaknesses to be, what do you think the best approach for the Americans to take is?
Well, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that any war between the U.S. and the Chinese will not conclude in the Taiwan Strait, in my opinion. If the U.S. and China were to go to war, the historical record shows that when great powers fight, these wars spread geographically and they last a very long time. So the first thing I would suggest to U.S. military planners is to expect a long war and a war that spreads. And then the second thing I would posit is that trying to fight in the one battlefield where the Chinese have the maximum advantage, that is the Taiwan Strait, is, I don't think, necessary or wise. And the example I keep thinking about historically is U.S. defense planning in the lead up to World War II regarding Japan, where military planners debated how much effort they should put into trying to protect the Philippines from Japanese conquest. And they concluded it just was too difficult, and they came up with a different plan to actually beat Japan. And I'm not saying the exact same thing should happen. Certainly there is a lot we can do to help Taiwan. We shouldn't just write them off. But the war that begins around Taiwan, I think, will spread and last a long time. Taiwan will be an important theater, but it will not be the only theater. And again, the Chinese military does have an advantage due to those missile systems around Taiwan, but everywhere else in the world, they are extremely weak and vulnerable. The U.S. will have, in my view, just an incredible advantage over the Chinese military in the Middle East and South China Sea, even outside the Second Island chain. Basically, anywhere else in the world, Chinese will be at severe disadvantage. So military planners should think of that when they contemplate a possible conflict with China.
Thank you, David. Back over to you, sir.
Thank you. So just to follow up on that, if you had them to grade China's real war fighting capabilities today, what would be your assessment and why?
I think overall I'd give them a C, maybe. They only have a C because their weapon systems and technologies, especially their missiles, are impressive. So they get high marks for developing a large network of anti-ship and surface-to-air missiles. And these missiles are what really threaten the U.S. military if it operates in the Taiwan Strait. And they do have some good modern ships. But outside of those strengths, Chinese military has serious limitations. Again, its command and control system, highly centralized and burdened with political controls, really raises questions about their ability to operate in a responsive and flexible way on the battlefield. Their aircraft cannot really operate very far from China due to a lack of tankers and inexperience with long-range combat operations. Their submarine force is very noisy and inferior to the U.S. military's. And their surface ships, while they are good, surface ships everywhere are just vulnerable to missiles and torpedoes. So the things that make U.S. surface ships vulnerable in the Taiwan Strait are the same things that make Chinese ships vulnerable anywhere else. U.S. aircraft, submarines, and ships could target Chinese naval ships outside the Taiwan Strait and damage them pretty easily. So I think overall, outside the one area of strength, which are its missile forces, modern warships, I think those are a couple areas of strengths. There's just so many vulnerabilities and limitations in the rest of the military that in general, I caution people against exaggerating how capable the Chinese military is.
So, C in the confines of classroom still passes. C in the confines of war is still dangerous, but
Yeah.
not as threatening as we or the average person think
Yeah.
it is. Do you agree
I,
on that?
I agree. I think, I don't want to make the mistake of dismissing the Chinese altogether. That's a dangerous thing to dismiss and denigrate a potential adversary as hopeless and incapable. The U.S. has made that mistake many times, all the way back to the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq. So it's smart not to dismiss the potential warfighting skills of the Chinese, and they could surprise us, perhaps. They could, and I've argued elsewhere, they could dismantle all political controls in wartime and innovate and find ways to improve on the fly and just learning from experience, improve their ability to operate. So I think I give them credit for that. That's why I suggest a grade of C, which is a passing grade, which suggests they could be dangerous. But at the same time, I caution against exaggerating they are. One other point to make is if you think about our most capable adversaries in history, the militaries that really were impressive and scored victories against U.S. military and were really hard fought wars to carry out. Think of the Germans in World War II, Japanese in the Korean War, the Chinese and the Koreans. The things that made them so effective and formidable were things like brilliant operations and tactics, discipline and training of the troops, incredible morale, ruthless leadership, and operational, really innovative doctrine. And it's hard to see any of those qualities applying to the PLA. They've got good technology, these missiles mainly. Outside of that, very untested. Their leadership's riven with corruption and in general inexperience. And their doctrine is, it's not very well implemented. There's a lot of theory writings, but we haven't seen evidence that they are testing these out, certainly not in combat. So it's all unproven and theoretical. So I think when we evaluate military capabilities, we have to look at it holistically, look at leadership, look at, doctrine, skill, morale, all these features. And if we do that, we'll see that in general, there's serious questions about the Chinese military, even if we concede they have some very good capabilities, especially in their missiles.
So morale and corruption brings me to the internal version of this or role of the military here, regime stability. In your recent work, you argue that China's military remains oriented toward internal control over external warfighting. Why does that matter strategically?
Well, it matters because militaries tend to be optimized for one function or another. Most militaries in the world, I would argue, are optimized for keeping their ruler in power. Think of the militaries in the Middle East. A lot of the militaries who in Africa, developing world militaries in general, militaries are viewed as extremely useful instruments for keeping the population under control and the leader in power. And this is true of China as well. The difference is that the Chinese have developed or evolved beyond the basic crude uses of the military, which is sending troops in the streets and bashing heads and rounding up dissidents. They have offloaded that responsibility to the People's Armed Police and security forces. But the military still plays a very important role in keeping Xi Jinping in power. They do by several things. First, they are extremely important for propaganda and inciting patriotic enthusiasm for the leadership. And they do this with parades, high-profile demonstrations, intimidating displays, missile launches and tests, all of which are well covered in the press and receive a lot of propaganda reporting. And then they also carry out operations and actions, non-war, but important operations and actions to keep economic related goods coming into China. So they patrol off the Horn of Africa. They participate in UN missions to ensure oil can come out of Sudan and to China. That's another way to help the regime stay in power. And they support Xi Jinping personally. And Xi Jinping cultivates their loyalty assiduously, partly by generously giving them big defense budgets and budget increases, partly by purging them ruthlessly whenever any of them seem the slightest bit disloyal, partly by relentless indoctrination and stricter party controls, which have increased under Xi Jinping to make sure the military remains fundamentally loyal to Xi Jinping. Just as a side note, the people may not realize, but the Chinese military, every soldier and service member swears an oath of loyalty to Xi Jinping himself.
Hmm.
And that's just characteristic of this political army.
Interesting. I have a question on demographics, economics, domestic pressure, and how does that shape the external posture. Let me ask that to you, John, and then leave you the microphone to ask Tim follow-ups. So how does China's domestic pressure shape its external posture?
Do you want me to take that?
Sure. Sure. Why don't you give us your thoughts on that, and then the microphone is yours for questions to Tim.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of people have written and talked about the rather strange Chinese demographics that are at play, and, the long-term effect of the one-child policy, and how that might actually have a somewhat of a restraining effect on the willingness of Chinese leaders to go to war, where there could be a lot of casualties. And many people postulated a war with Taiwan, particularly if it doesn't go well for China, they could suffer, large numbers of casualties. And having, a population now which is increasingly one-child families, some people have mentioned this could be an issue. I think also in terms of the demographics and the economy, I think the expectations of the Chinese people have been growing and growing and growing in recent years. And clearly a war over Taiwan or any other major war in Asia is an extremely risky proposition for China. This is a big deal. And the fact that it could go badly for them, and this would be somewhat of a roll of the dice on the part of the regime. If it doesn't go well, they risk, critical support on the part of the population. So I think that would be at the back of the mind of all the Chinese leaders as they're going through. If they find themselves, for whatever reason, getting into a crisis situation, is it really worth going to war, given the fact of the demographic pressures that they are under and the expectations of the population to not go through all the deprivation, that would be involved in a long war. So that's my personal take on how that is. Tim might want to modify that a little bit. The question I had for Tim, or the sort of the two-part question I had, related to the remarks that he just made a few moments ago. Tim, a lot of people, and I think this dovetails with some of your insights about the Chinese military being, like many other militaries, at the end of the day, they're really about internal security and regime stability and regime, maintenance of the regime. A lot of people were very surprised at the very poor performance of the Russian military in Ukraine. And I think some people could argue that, like the case you were mentioning, the Russian military, at the end of the day, really wasn't there for conquest. It was there to maintain the regime. And it didn't do well in Ukraine. So the two-part question I have for you is, one, do you think that is kind of some significant lessons for the leadership in Beijing? Because no doubt Putin was being told by all his generals that this was going to be a cakewalk, this was going to be a piece of cake. Let's what are we worried about? Let's just go ahead and do it. 30, 40 days, this war is going to be over. And it ended up being a colossal quagmire for the Russians. So do you think there's some lesson there for the leadership in Beijing? And the final part of my question is, given this internal focus that you're saying the Chinese mostly have, and this niche they have in missiles, but weaknesses in a lot of other areas, what should the U.S. military be looking for? What are the red flags the U.S. military should be watching for might indicate the Chinese military is getting better over time and more capable at things like modern joint operations, like the U.S. and other militaries are capable of? So, over to you to comment on my point, and then questions for you, sir.
All right. Well, a lot of really meaty questions from both of you. I'll just pile on to what you said, John, earlier about
It is
demographics.
the Shar school, Tim, so we're definitely going to be tough on you on
I
questions here.
feel
No,
like
no
I'm in the,
softballs. This is a
That's
real
right.
discussion, real
yeah,
Right.
policy.
I feel like I'm in
Mason,
the room of
Mason on
PhD.
Mason. Got to get our pound of flesh out of this guy.
Yeah, yeah, no, this is great. So on the comments of demographics and economics, I think John's spot on. Yes, I think the overall effect of a decelerating economy, rising unemployment, and underperformance by the CCP government is lowering public trust and support for the CCP. And there's numerous polls, Western scholars who have found ways to get around Chinese censors. When they do polls, they find support is dropping for the CCPs below 50% probably at this point. And we saw flashes of that during zero COVID. There's a lot of frustration and disappointment. What does that mean in wartime? Well, the data I look at is what happened in governments and militaries that went to war in the past couple of years. Governments like the U.S. government, the Russian government. What those countries found is that perpetually tenuous support for their leaders, and the U.S. has struggled with its own problems of low popular support, and same with Putin, made it very difficult to mobilize support for war. Neither country, neither the U.S. or the Russians, were able to carry out a total mobilization, and instead they relied heavily on volunteers and contractors to do the fighting. And I think something very similar would happen to the Chinese. They would have a very hard time carrying out a mobilization and conscripting people to serve in the war. And they probably would have to resort to a lot of contracts and trying to get volunteers to fight, which would make it very difficult for them to sustain a war that, especially if it involved a lot of casualties, high casualties. So I'm very skeptical that these economic pressures will spur the Chinese to become more aggressive. What we've seen in countries around the world is, in general, the opposite. Countries become more reluctant, and the U.S. certainly is in that posture right now, much more reluctant to risk involving itself in large-scale war. And certainly Putin, I'm sure, has his regrets, so he'll never admit them, about how his war has spiraled. And and I agree with you, some very good observations, John, about the one-child policy and we got to remember the PLA is trying to build a high-tech military, which means they're trying to recruit educated young people. And educated urban young people in general are not eager to serve in the military, one, and the PLA struggles with recruitment, and they actually have problems with desertion as well, and just having a hard time keeping people in service. It's going to be hard for them to attract and recruit large numbers of these folks to fight in a war, since a lot of war is just not very popular with urban, educated young people who, if they serve in the military at all, tend to look for opportunities for career enhancement. So, big questions about, I think overall, the demographic and economic pressures pose strong disincentives for the CCP to risk war. John's questions about the lessons from Russia. An important difference between the Russians and the Chinese is that Putin actually has been fighting for years. Since 2008, at least, when he attacked Georgia. He's comfortable with using the military as a blunt instrument against neighbors, and has used them repeatedly. So I could see why he believed probably that he could do it again. He succeeded in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, 2014. Maybe what he overlooked was that those were much smaller operations, and therefore confidence that it could steamroll Ukraine was seriously misplaced, obviously. And I think very possible that his advisors misled him as to the state of readiness. Chinese, I think, are a little more realistic about the limitations of the PLA. Xi Jinping himself has issued numerous criticisms of their failings and inadequacies. He's criticized their inability to carry out joint operations and and the problem of corruption and their lack of a warfighting spirit. Many other points he's noted, which suggests his confidence in the PLA to start a war is not especially high. And if you think about the scenario people talk about, a war with Taiwan that involves the U.S., to me, it's just a real stretch to think Xi Jinping would be willing to put an untested military riven with corruption against a premier world military, given all the stakes and all the chips on the table. It's like reckless beyond belief. And Maybe if Xi Jinping was a reckless guy, that might be plausible, but he hasn't really shown himself to be that. It's very cautious, actually. Bully and a dictator and, brutal guy, but cautious in general in using his military. And then regarding, how do we know? John offered another good question. How do we know if the military was really serious about becoming a war-fighting machine? I think the most important indicators would be political. This is why I think why I am more concerned about Xi's successor than Xi Jinping. I don't think Xi at this point, he's 70 something years old. I don't think there's any indication that he's going to suddenly turn into, a Stalin or a Hitler, anything like their Tojo military aggressor. He's consumed by a lot of other worries. But what about successor? I think the most important indicators would be political. A leader who comes into power and says that he wants to use the military in a much more aggressive way and demands that they be ready to carry out aggression. And a leader who praises the virtues of combat and downplays fears about bloodshed and urges the military to be prepared for combat and directs them to plan and prepare for combat. Those political indicators of a leader who is eager to use military power and a military that responds by dismantling all the things that get in the way of combat effectiveness, maybe gets rid of party committees or downgrades party commissars, political commissars in the way the Soviets did in World War II. Reduces their authority to improve unified command. A military that starts testing out combat capabilities on neighbors. Maybe it provokes a fight with a neighbor in Southeast Asia or some clash, maybe with Taiwan, just to start testing and seeing how good the capabilities are so they can fine tune it. All those kinds, and those are the kinds of behavior we have seen in previous aggressors. They have the political leadership that extols war and demands the military be ready for war. They start testing the military out in smaller contingencies and clashes and refining their capabilities. And they start promoting military leaders who are actually brilliant and operationally skilled versus just, bootlickers and loyalists. So those are the sorts of indicators I would look for if the PLA was really shifting from a political posture to a combat posture.
Interesting that the red flags are political and not military. The average person would have thought differently, right? Because obviously we don't follow as you do
John's
every day.
point, this is a common issue, I think, in our defense communities. We often focus extremely narrowly on hardware, military hardware, to give us a sense of combat readiness, and we overlook the critical non-hardware components, as we did in the Russia-Ukraine case.
All right, let me follow up on that. You made clearly the point that the red flags are political. This is a political decision, not a military decision. We talked a little bit about Ukraine and Russia and the similarities and dissimilarities there. There is this prevailing belief out there that if we give up on Ukraine, that means we're really telling China Taiwan is yours, and we will, as the U.S., we will probably, that means, or signal to China that if we gave up on Ukraine, therefore there's probably not going to be a defense of Taiwan by the United States. Explore that for us, Tim.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I do think that the Chinese watch the U.S. behavior regarding Ukraine, and if not China, then certainly countries in East Asia certainly take lessons from the U.S. will to get involved and willingness to offer its own resources and the blood of its soldiers to help friends. So at some level, I think the Chinese certainly could be encouraged if they saw the U.S. end its support for Ukraine and permit Russia to conquer it, or at least conclude the war on favorable terms that Putin wants. Could be. However, there are some very important differences that limit really what the Chinese can do about that. First, Ukraine never really had an alliance with the U.S. There was really no chance the U.S. military would get directly involved when Putin launched his attack, and Putin knew this. There's a reason why Putin was willing to attack Ukraine, but not any of its NATO allies on his border. he does not want a direct clash. He knows he can't afford a direct clash with the U.S. and all of NATO. So he picked on Ukraine, which is unallied and alone and vulnerable, extremely vulnerable. Taiwan is different than Ukraine. Taiwan has a security relationship with the U.S. It's informal and implied, but no one questions it. Therefore, the risk of U.S. involvement is way higher, extremely high, compared to what Putin faced with Ukraine. Now, it's not 100%. Even if the U.S. government signaled hesitancy about Ukraine, given all that, even despite that, the Chinese cannot be sure what the U.S. might do if they attack Taiwan. There is still some percent chance the U.S. could choose not to get involved, but could also get involved. And if they get involved, in my opinion, it's a catastrophe for China. It is an utter catastrophe. And because, as I mentioned before, when great powers fight, their wars escalate and they grow and they tend to last for years. And given that these two countries have massive nuclear arsenals, there's no way to control how this war could evolve. It could evolve into nuclear exchanges. And therefore, the risk is just infinitely higher for China than it ever was for Russia when they contemplated attacking Ukraine.
Thank you. All right, let's talk a little bit about U.S. deterrence and joint force posture in the Indo-Pacific. John, take us there.
All these points are weaving together very, very nicely together throughout the discussion. I think it's going very well. Tim, the perception in the U.S. military is right now, I think this is a commonly held belief for good reason, that given the fact the United States has actually announced China is the quote-unquote pacing threat for the U.S. military, that the relative winners within the U.S. military are going to be the Navy and the Air Force. That if in the fortunately unlikely event that we would have to, get in a conflict with China, that we would fight primarily with air and naval forces. Of course, cyber and space capabilities would be enormously important, no question. And the ground force, particularly U.S. Army, to some extent the Marine Corps, would be the relative losers in the coming years as the U.S., reprioritizes toward, a force that's really, again, to the largest extent optimized to deter our now announced pacing threat of China. Again, that seems to be the perception, if you comment on that. But part of that is the Army and the Marine Corps, probably especially the U.S. Army, are becoming increasingly anxious because of the distances in the Pacific and because of the nature of a fight against China with these missiles and the very great distances. The Army in particular seems to be very interested in getting access in countries in the region for military operational reasons, the range of its missiles, et cetera, deployment considerations, where the Army's trying to get access to places like the Philippines and southern Japan to posture itself better in the event of a war with China. And I'm curious your thoughts about how the Chinese see, how the Chinese are going to react to that if they see a country like the Philippines throwing its doors open to allow, like, U.S. Army and to some extent U.S. Marine Corps forces to be based there. And those two services clearly do want to be based there in order to be in a better position to fight China. So your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I agree that as currently conceived, all scenarios about a U.S.-China war envision a primarily maritime battle, and the winners in those scenarios, capabilities that are most relevant appear to be Air Force and Navy. However, as I mentioned before, I think too often, our defense community only focuses on it's really not even a war, it's a battle around Taiwan. That's what we're talking about. People are mainly talking about a battle around Taiwan in the same way that defense analysts talked about a battle near the Philippines in a hypothetical war with Japan. It's almost like that's all we're talking about. Imagine in 1930s if all of the U.S. military planning focused on how to defend the Philippines, and that was it. And we optimize all our capabilities for that. I fear that we kind of do that in many ways about Taiwan. It's all we talk about is this battle around Taiwan and how to fight this battle. But as I mentioned, I think a war with China would be One, it'd be multilateral and multi partner with multiple theaters. I think most likely countries would join with China against the U.S. Countries have grievances against the U.S. and Europe, maybe North Korea, maybe Iran, maybe Russia. We don't know for sure. It's all hypothetical. So it's very likely that this war would spread horizontally, potentially vertically. And if that's true, then the U.S. Army will have an important role in many theaters where there's more of a ground war. And therefore, we need to bear that in mind when we think about potential war with China. It's going to be a big war. It's not just going to be the Taiwan battle. It's going to be bigger, involving many other countries and other theaters. The second point is, I think, how the Chinese view a U.S. Army or Marine posture in the Philippines. I do think that has some deterrent value. In general, I think, and I'm very skeptical the Chinese are eager for a fight with the U.S. They probably would view that kind of presence as very threatening and intimidating. They would make a lot of political noise about it and probably pressure Philippines diplomatically to push the U.S. out. So, in other words, I think a growing U.S. Army presence along the periphery of China will intensify a peacetime competition and diplomatic struggle between the U.S. and China for influence in countries around the region, and it definitely could have some deterrent influence. But I don't think by itself that presence will decide the Chinese one way or the other. In general, I think they have other compelling reasons not to start a war with the U.S.
David, back over to you, sir.
We are running up on time. I could spend another hour talking China policy with both of you, but let me finish with a couple quick lightning round questions. The first one is for you, Tim. If you could give Congress one recommendation to improve the U.S. deterrence, what would it be?
Plan for a broader war and make sure capabilities are available for a fight beyond the Taiwan battle.
Thank you. Now same question for both of you. I'll start with you, Tim, and then same question for you, John. For our Mason students and for young professionals out there, what's the one thing about great power competition you wish they understood better that doesn't show up in headlines? Tim.
Yeah, for me, I think that the low support for governments everywhere profoundly affects what countries can do with their militaries, how they can fight, and how they can wage war. And I think we need to better understand the impact of low domestic political support for governments on military operations.
Thank you. John, same question. The one thing about great power competition you wish our students and young professionals understand better?
I think I would say, David, that I would wish that as going forward, students would have a better appreciation of the broad implications of this type of conflict. In the first 10 or 15 years after the end of the Cold War, mostly in the 1990s, early 2000s, the United States really had the luxury of dealing with, C grade or below regional opponents like Iraq twice and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And I think whether it's Russia or China, where this is an entirely different league of competition that's much more multifaceted, much longer, potentially has much graver consequences for all concerned. So we're in a different world now than we were in that first, as I said, 15-ish years after the Cold War. And I think it's incumbent on people to understand, how complex this level of and potentially dangerous this level of competition is.
Thank you. Dr. Heath, Dr. Gordon, any final thoughts?
No, I first off just want to thank you, David, for inviting me. And John, it's been a real pleasure to work with you in this context. Just great to be with you virtually and all my fellow GMU students and alumni, and wish everyone well and happy holidays.
Tim, John, thank you both for this deeply informative and sober discussion. Your analysis helps separate fact from fear and shows where serious choices will need to be made in the years ahead. Listeners, you can explore more of Tim and John's work at rand.org and access all episodes of Policy and Government Perspectives at char.gmu.edu/podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. We are on every major network. I am Dr. David Ramadan. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
That brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives. We truly appreciate you joining us for these important discussions featuring voices from across the Schar School. For more information and to explore our archive of past episodes, please visit char.gmu.edu/podcast. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to sharing more with you next time.